What happens when a single vintage watch can unravel the carefully constructed lies behind America's most powerful media empire? For Michelle Carter, a 27-year-old night janitor struggling to pay for her son's autism therapy, that watch was a pocket timepiece her grandfather had left her. For William Hastings, the media mogul whose television networks and newspapers shaped public opinion across the nation, it was a ghost from his family's past that threatened to expose the blood-soaked foundation of their influence. She was just cleaning the executive offices of the country's largest broadcasting company. He was just another powerful man working late in his corner office. But when her grandfather's pocket watch fell from her cleaning supplies, revealing an inscription that matched the one on his desk nameplate, both their worlds would explode like dynamite. This isn't a story about media manipulation. This is about how a single moment of recognition can detonate decades of buried atrocities, and how sometimes the truth has a way of demanding justice, no matter how long it takes. The polished granite floors of the Hastings Media Tower reflected the city lights streaming through the glass walls, creating patterns that shifted with every passing cloud. At 2:30 on a Thursday morning, the 42nd floor hummed with the quiet efficiency of a skeleton crew, where night shift workers moved like shadows through the empire that controlled America's news cycle. Michelle Carter pushed her cleaning cart down the executive corridor with practiced silence, her grey uniform marking her as part of the invisible workforce that kept the tower running. Every movement sent pain through her exhausted body from working 3 jobs, but her 4-year-old son Tommy's specialized therapy sessions weren't going to pay for themselves. The Autism Treatment Center was making remarkable progress with him, and Michelle's wages from the cleaning company, the grocery store, and weekend landscaping work were all that kept him in the program that was slowly teaching him to communicate. The antique pocket watch in her supply cart had belonged to her grandfather, Frank Carter, a man who had raised Michelle after her parents died in a house fire when she was 8. It was an elegant gold timepiece with Roman numerals and intricate engravings around the face. The back was inscribed with words that had puzzled Michelle for years. To FC, Truth Will Prevail, HH 1962. Despite its obvious value and her desperate financial situation, she had never considered selling it. Grandfather Frank had made her promise to keep it safe, telling her it was evidence of something important that the world needed to know. In the corner office, a man in his 60s sat hunched over financial reports, his presence commanding even in solitude. William Hastings was distinguished and calculating, with steel-grey hair and eyes like black ice. His navy suit was wrinkled from the long day, but the gold nameplate on his desk gleamed under the lamplight. William H. Hastings III, Chairman and CEO. He controlled the largest media conglomerate in North America, with the power to shape elections, destroy reputations, and control the flow of information to millions of Americans. As Michelle entered to empty the wastebaskets and dust the shelves, her fatigue finally overwhelmed her coordination. The handle of her supply cart caught on the doorframe, sending cleaning supplies tumbling across the marble floor. Among the scattered items, her grandfather's pocket watch bounced once and slid to rest directly in front of Hastings' desk. William Hastings looked down at the watch, and his black eyes fixed on the golden timepiece with an expression of pure terror. The blood drained from his face as if he had seen the dead rise from their graves. "Where did you get that watch?" His voice was a harsh whisper, each word deliberate and threatening. Michelle's pulse raced as she scrambled to gather the scattered supplies. "It was my grandfather's, sir. Frank Carter. He left it to me when he passed away." Hastings' hand moved to his nameplate, his fingers tracing the engraved letters with trembling recognition. The inscription on the watch, HH 1962, matched his own initials perfectly. "Frank Carter," he repeated, the name seeming to physically pain him. "What did he do for a living?" "He was a journalist," Michelle replied, confused by the intensity of his reaction. "He worked for newspapers before I was born. He used to tell me stories about exposing corruption and fighting for the truth. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken dread. Around them, the executive office seemed to shrink, filled with the weight of buried secrets. "Frank Carter died in 1962, Hastings whispered finally. "He was an investigative reporter. He was killed in a house fire along with his entire family." The words struck Michelle like lightning. "That's impossible. Grandfather Frank lived until 2018. He raised me after my parents died. He told me stories about his work uncovering corporate conspiracies, about discovering something so terrible that powerful people tried to silence him forever." Hastings' breathing became ragged. "What did he tell you about that?" Michelle glanced around nervously, suddenly aware of how isolated they were in the tower at this hour. "He said he had found evidence that a media company was covering up a mining disaster, that they were suppressing stories about worker deaths to protect their advertisers' profits. He had to disappear because they threatened to kill him if he published the truth." The media mogul's face went ashen. He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a leather portfolio, from which he produced a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Reporter and family perish in tragic house fire. Carter investigation dies with him." Below the headline was a photograph of a young man with intelligent eyes and a determined expression. He bore a striking resemblance to Michelle, particularly around the eyes and the stubborn set of his jaw. "Frank Carter," Hastings said, his voice breaking. "Son of coal miners, brilliant investigative journalist, and the man whose exposé would have destroyed my family's media empire 60 years ago." Michelle studied the photograph, her mind spinning. The man in the picture could have been her twin, separated by 6 decades. "If Frank Carter is my grandfather," Michelle said slowly, "and he was investigating your family's company, then you're not just some janitor who happened to clean my office," Hastings replied, his voice hollow with realization. "You're the granddaughter of the man whose murder launched my family's rise to media dominance. You're living proof that our greatest crime wasn't buried as completely as we believed." The pocket watch lay on the marble floor between them, its gold surface catching the desk lamp's light like a beacon. It was more than a timepiece. It was evidence, a witness to crimes that had shaped 6 decades of media manipulation. But Frank Carter hadn't died in that house fire. He had escaped, hidden, built a new life under a new identity. And now his granddaughter stood in the heart of the empire that had tried to destroy him, carrying the proof that could bring down a dynasty built on silenced truth. The next evening, Michelle found herself in William Hastings' private library at his estate in the Connecticut countryside. A mansion that represented generations of media wealth accumulated through increasingly ruthless methods. The room was lined with rare books and framed front pages from major historical events that his family's newspapers had helped shape. "I need to show you something," Hastings said, his voice heavy with 6 decades of suppressed guilt. He moved to a hidden compartment behind a bookshelf containing first editions of classic literature. He withdrew a metal document box and spread its contents across his antique reading table. Inside were investigation notes, photographs, and correspondence that made Michelle's blood run cold. "The truth about what happened in 1962, Hastings began, "is that Frank discovered my grandfather's company was covering up a coal mine collapse in West Virginia. 43 miners died because of safety violations. But we owned the local newspapers and had major advertising contracts with the mining company." Michelle picked up one of the investigation files, her hands shaking as she read her grandfather's meticulous documentation of the cover-up. "He tried to publish the story." "He did more than try," Hastings said bitterly. He had compiled irrefutable evidence that would have exposed not just the mining deaths, but our systematic suppression of industrial accident stories throughout Appalachia. He was scheduled to present his findings to a Senate committee the week after the fire. His testimony would have destroyed our media empire and sent my grandfather to federal prison. He pulled out a series of internal company memos marked "Confidential, destroy after reading," that detailed the family's plan to eliminate Frank before he could testify. The house fire wasn't an accident, Michelle said, the horrible truth crystallizing in her mind. My grandfather ordered it, Hastings confirmed, his voice cracking. He had Frank's house doused with gasoline and set ablaze while the family was supposed to be sleeping inside. The plan was to make it look like an electrical fire that killed everyone and destroyed all the evidence. Michelle thought of her grandfather's nightmares. The way he would sometimes wake up screaming about smoke and flames. The paranoia that had made him change their address every few years throughout her childhood. But he survived, Michelle said softly. Somehow, yes. He must have gotten suspicious and moved his family out before the fire, or maybe he was working late and came home to find the house burning. When the flames died down and bodies were found, everyone assumed Frank and his family were among the victims. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. How many stories did you suppress? Hastings closed his eyes. Hundreds over the decades. Mining accidents, chemical spills, factory explosions, toxic waste dumps. Any story that threatened our major advertisers got buried. Frank's supposed death became the cautionary tale that kept other journalists from digging too deep. And your media empire was built on a foundation of silenced tragedies, Michelle said, the accusation hanging heavy in the air. Every newspaper we've bought, every television station we've launched, every story we've chosen to tell or not tell, it's all been shaped by the knowledge that we could make inconvenient truths disappear, Hastings admitted. I've spent 60 years trying to find ways to make amends, but I was too much of a coward to expose what we'd done. Before Michelle could respond, the library door burst open. A woman in her 40s entered without knocking, her expensive clothing unable to disguise the predatory calculation in her eyes. Behind her came a younger man who shared Hastings' features, but none of his evident remorse. Father, the woman said, her voice sharp with suspicion. Security said you had brought someone to the estate. How very unlike you. Victoria, Hastings said, his tone immediately guarded. This is Michelle Carter. Michelle, my daughter Victoria Hastings Blake and my son Andrew Hastings. Victoria's predatory gaze swept over Michelle's modest clothing with barely concealed disdain. And what brings Miss Carter to our family home? Michelle is Frank Carter's granddaughter, Hastings said simply. The effect was instantaneous. Both siblings went rigid, and Andrew actually stepped backward. The name hung in the air like a death sentence. That's impossible, Victoria breathed. Frank Carter died in the house fire. It was 60 years ago. Apparently he survived, Hastings replied. He changed his identity and built a new life. Michelle is living proof that the family's darkest secret wasn't buried as completely as we thought. Andrew found his voice first, his tone sharp with panic. This is ridiculous. Some random cleaning lady shows up with an old watch and a convenient story, and you're ready to confess to crimes that happened before she was born. She's obviously running an extortion scheme. The watch is authentic, Hastings said coldly. I gave it to Frank myself in 1962, along with a promise to protect his investigation. Instead, I stood by while my grandfather had him murdered. Victoria moved closer to the table, studying the documents with the intensity of a media executive calculating damage control. Even if this wild tale were true, she said slowly, it changes nothing legally. Frank Carter has no standing. He was never part of this family, but his granddaughter might have a moral claim to justice, Hastings said quietly. The words exploded like a bomb in the quiet library. Victoria's composed mask cracked, revealing the naked ambition underneath. What exactly are you suggesting, Father? Andrew demanded, his voice rising. I'm suggesting that maybe it's time this family faced the consequences of our crimes. Maybe it's time we made restitution for the voices we've silenced. Restitution? Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want to destroy our family's media empire based on the fantasies of some opportunistic stranger. I want to stop living with the knowledge that our influence is built on the graves of miners and factory workers whose stories were never told, Hastings shot back. The tension in the room was suffocating. Michelle could see the cold calculation in both siblings' eyes as they assessed how this revelation threatened not just their inheritance, but their own positions in the media landscape. "I think," Victoria said with dangerous calm, "that we need to be very careful about entertaining unsubstantiated claims from outsiders. The Hastings family name represents generations of journalistic integrity. It would be tragic if our reputation were damaged by someone with questionable motives." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Michelle felt the same chill her grandfather must have experienced all those years ago when powerful people decided he was too dangerous to live. "Are you threatening her?" Hastings asked, his voice deadly quiet. "I'm protecting this family," Victoria replied smoothly, "as someone should have done 60 years ago." Michelle realized with growing horror that she had walked into the same trap that had nearly killed her grandfather. The Hastings family's willingness to commit murder to protect their media empire hadn't ended with the elder Hastings. It had simply evolved into more sophisticated forms of destruction. The war for the truth had begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. Over the following weeks, the attacks were swift and merciless. Michelle's position with the cleaning company was terminated due to budget constraints. Her son Tommy's therapy center suddenly required additional insurance verification that tied up his treatment in bureaucratic red tape. Her car was repossessed due to irregularities in her payment history that turned out to be fabricated. When Michelle's apartment building received an anonymous tip about dangerous activities that triggered a full investigation by child services, she knew the full weight of the Hastings media machine was being brought to bear against her. William Hastings, meanwhile, was conducting his own investigation into the scope of his family's cover-ups. Using his access to company archives, he uncovered evidence that the story suppression had been even more extensive than he had originally known. "It's not just industrial accidents," he told Michelle during a clandestine meeting in a small cafe outside the city. "We've been burying stories about environmental contamination, political corruption, corporate fraud, anything that threatened the interests of our major advertisers and political allies." "How many people died because those stories were never told?" Michelle asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Thousands, possibly tens of thousands. And it's still happening. Victoria and Andrew have modernized the operation. They use social media manipulation, targeted disinformation campaigns, and coordinated news blackouts to control public perception." The revelation was staggering in its scope. Michelle was beginning to understand that her grandfather hadn't just discovered a single cover-up. He had stumbled onto a systematic corruption of American journalism that had shaped public knowledge for generations. The breaking point came when Michelle arrived at the therapy center to find Tommy being released from the program. The head administrator explained apologetically that there had been questions raised about the effectiveness of his treatment and the legitimacy of his diagnosis. "I don't understand," Michelle said, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "Tommy has been making incredible progress. His therapists have documented his improvements every week. He's finally starting to communicate. There's been a review of his case," the administrator said uncomfortably. "Questions about whether he truly requires this level of specialized intervention. I'm sorry, Miss Carter. The decision has been made." Michelle knew with absolute certainty who was behind this. She also knew that Tommy, who was just beginning to break through his communication barriers, would regress dramatically without the specialized therapy that was helping him connect with the world. That night she called William Hastings from a payphone outside the center. "They're going to destroy him," she said without preamble, "just like they tried to destroy Frank." "Who? What happened?" She told him about the program termination, the fabricated questions about Tommy's progress, the systematic destruction of everything she had worked to build for her son. As she spoke, she could hear Hastings' breathing grow harsh with rage. 60 years, he said finally. 60 years, and they're still using the same tactics, still destroying innocent lives to protect their empire of lies. "I can't fight them," Michelle said, her voice breaking. "I don't have their resources, their media connections, but you have something they don't," Hastings interrupted. "You have the truth, and you have me. I've been a coward for 6 decades, but I won't be one anymore. Are you ready to finish what your grandfather started?" Michelle thought of Frank's final words to her. "The truth always finds a way to surface, little one. Sometimes it just takes the right person to dig it up." "Yes," she said, her voice steady with newfound determination. "Tell me what we need to do." The annual National Media Convention was held in the grand ballrooms of the Chicago Convention Center, where journalists, editors, and media executives from across the country gathered to discuss the future of American journalism. It was the most important media event of the year, where the direction of news coverage and public discourse was shaped. Michelle had never imagined she would enter such a place. The convention center's soaring architecture represented the pinnacle of media influence, and she felt like an intruder in the professional attire Hastings had insisted she wear. "This is where it ends," he had told her during their final planning session. "In front of everyone who has shaped America's understanding of truth." Victoria and Andrew worked the convention with practiced skill, their media personas never faltering even as they kept careful watch on their father. They had grown increasingly concerned about his erratic behavior in recent weeks, his obsession with ancient family history, and most disturbing of all, his growing alliance with the cleaning woman who claimed to be connected to a journalist who had died decades ago. The convention's main session proceeded normally through the morning panels and networking lunch. Media executives and journalism school deans congratulated themselves on their commitment to truth and transparency, while carefully avoiding any mention of the stories that had been buried to protect powerful interests. But when William Hastings took the podium for his scheduled keynote address on media responsibility, something was different in his demeanor, a tension that suggested the afternoon was about to take an unexpected turn. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the convention hall's sound system. "Today, I want to talk to you about the true cost of media consolidation." A murmur ran through the distinguished audience. This wasn't the expected speech about technological innovation and market efficiency. 60 years ago, Hastings continued, my family made a decision that has corrupted American journalism ever since. To protect our advertising revenue and political influence, we orchestrated the murder of an investigative reporter who tried to expose the truth about industrial accidents. The murmur grew to shocked gasps. Victoria was pushing through the crowd toward the stage, her face pale with panic. The man who died trying to inform the American people was named Frank Carter. He was a reporter for the Pittsburgh Herald, and he had compiled irrefutable evidence that we were systematically suppressing stories about workplace deaths to protect our corporate partners. A spotlight found Michelle in the audience. She lifted her chin, meeting Hastings' gaze across the convention hall with steady resolve. But Frank Carter didn't die in that house fire. He survived, changed his identity, and spent the rest of his life in hiding, too afraid to come forward with the truth that could have saved countless lives. Victoria reached the side of the stage and was frantically gesturing to the event coordinator, trying to get him to cut the microphone. But like everyone else in the hall, the coordinator was transfixed by the unfolding confession. "Today," Hastings said, his voice growing stronger, "I'm proud to introduce Frank Carter's granddaughter, Michelle Carter, who has helped me uncover the full scope of our family's crimes against journalistic integrity." The convention hall erupted in chaos. Some attendees were applauding, others were arguing loudly, and several media executives were heading for the exits. But Hastings wasn't finished. "I'm also announcing that I've discovered evidence of ongoing criminal activity within my own family. My children have continued our tradition of story suppression, using modern technology to manipulate public perception and silence inconvenient truths. He looked directly at Victoria and Andrew, who had both gone white as sheets. "This evidence has been turned over to federal prosecutors and the Federal Communications Commission. Anyone involved in this decades-long conspiracy against press freedom will be held accountable." Victoria's media composure finally shattered completely. "You senile old fool!" she screamed, her voice carrying even without amplification. "She's nothing but a con artist, a janitor trying to destroy our family's legacy." "Legacy?" Hastings' voice cut through her hysteria. "What legacy, Victoria? The legacy of buried stories? The legacy of silenced voices?" He gestured to Michelle, who was walking toward the stage, with her head held high despite the hundreds of eyes upon her. Frank Carter was 34 when he discovered that the media company he trusted was built on a foundation of covered-up deaths. Hastings continued as Michelle joined him at the podium. He chose truth over safety, justice over comfort. He gave up everything, his name, his career, his byline, to try to give voice to the voiceless. His voice broke with 6 decades of suppressed emotion. "I can't give Frank back the stories he never got to write. I can't undo 60 years of hiding and fear. But I can make sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain." He turned to Michelle, taking her hands in his. "I can't replace your grandfather, and I can't erase the struggles your family has faced because of mine. But I can promise you this: the Hastings name will never again be used to silence truth or hide injustice." He faced the stunned assembly once more. "Effective immediately, I'm dissolving all Hastings media holdings and establishing a new foundation dedicated to investigative journalism and supporting the families of those whose stories were never told." The convention hall had fallen into stunned silence. Even Victoria stood frozen, realizing that her father's public confession had destroyed any chance of containing the scandal or maintaining their media empire. Michelle felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked out at the crowd of journalists and media executives. These were the people who had shaped American public discourse for generations, wielding the power to inform or mislead millions. But today, for the first time in her life, she felt their equal. "My grandfather Frank used to tell me that every untold story is a life that doesn't matter," she said, her voice steady despite her emotion. "He said that the greatest crime against democracy isn't stealing votes, it's stealing truth. He said that someday someone would have the courage to speak for those whose voices were silenced." She looked at Victoria and Andrew, who stood amid the wreckage of their carefully constructed media dynasty. Today is that someday. The aftermath of the media convention sent shockwaves through the journalism industry and beyond. Victoria and Andrew were arrested within days on charges ranging from conspiracy to commit fraud to violations of federal communications law. The investigation that followed uncovered the largest media manipulation scheme in American history, with evidence of systematic story suppression spanning 6 decades. The revelation about Frank Carter's murder triggered congressional hearings that exposed the extent to which major media companies had compromised journalistic integrity to protect corporate interests. The Hastings media empire, built on the foundation of silenced truth, faced complete dissolution. But from the ashes of the old regime, something meaningful began to emerge. 18 months after the convention, Michelle stood in the bright newsroom of the Frank Carter Institute for Investigative Journalism, watching as reporters and researchers prepared for the facility's official launch. Her son, Tommy, his communication skills flourishing thanks to the specialized therapy the new foundation had funded, sat nearby working on a tablet, his eyes bright with the curiosity that had been locked away for so long. "He would have been so proud," Tommy said, using the communication device to express thoughts he was finally able to form. "Grandpa Frank always said that truth belongs to everyone." The Institute would provide funding for investigative journalism, support for whistleblowers, and resources for families whose stories had been suppressed by powerful interests. It was the first of many projects funded by the liquidated Hastings fortune now dedicated to protecting the truth-tellers the family had spent generations silencing. William Hastings, now stripped of his media licenses and facing his own legal proceedings, approached from across the newsroom, moving with the careful steps of a man who had carried shame for 60 years, but was finally learning to transform it into purpose. "The dedication ceremony is about to begin," he said, offering Michelle his arm. "Ready to honor your grandfather's memory properly." Michelle smiled, touching the pocket watch at her waist, the same timepiece that had started this extraordinary journey. She had learned that the inscription on the back, "Truth Will Prevail," had been William's promise to Frank all those years ago, a promise that had taken 6 decades to keep. "I think he's been waiting for this day for 60 years, Michelle said as they walked toward the auditorium where hundreds of journalists and citizens waited. Not media moguls this time, but the people whose stories would finally be told. Hastings squeezed her arm gently. He raised a granddaughter who finished what he started. As Michelle stepped up to address the crowd, she thought about the incredible journey that had brought her here, from a struggling night janitor to the keeper of a legacy built on her grandfather's courage, and finally to someone who could transform that legacy into something Frank would have been proud of. The truth had indeed surfaced, just as her grandfather had always believed it would, and in its wake had come not just justice, but the rarest gift of all, the chance to turn a story of silenced voices into a symphony of truth that would never be quieted again. Standing at the podium, looking out at faces that reflected the struggles of truth-seekers everywhere, Michelle began her speech with the words her grandfather had whispered to her so many years ago. "Every untold story is a life that doesn't matter." Today, we're not just opening a news institute, we're proving that no amount of power or influence can silence the truth forever. In the audience, she could see Hastings wiping away tears, and she knew that somewhere Frank Carter was finally at peace. His battle against media corruption hadn't ended in defeat after all. It had just taken 60 years to find its way to victory. The story of Michelle Carter and William Hastings reminds us that the courage to challenge media manipulation can echo across generations. Sometimes it takes an outsider with nothing to lose to show us that our greatest weapon against information control isn't money or connections, but the simple refusal to let truth remain buried. Frank Carter never got to see the media empire that silenced him, transformed into a force for investigative journalism and press freedom. But through his granddaughter, his unwavering commitment to truth became the foundation of a new kind of legacy, one that proved the most powerful force against media corruption is simply refusing to let it remain hidden. What would you have done in Michelle's place? Would you have had the courage to challenge a media dynasty, even knowing it could cost you everything you held dear? If this story moved you, please share it with someone who believes in the power of ordinary people to hold media institutions accountable. Don't forget to follow our channel for more stories that celebrate the triumph of truth over manipulation and journalism over propaganda. And remember, sometimes the most important battles are fought not with money or influence, but with the simple determination to honor the silenced by amplifying their voices. Thank you for listening to this tale of courage, sacrifice, and the incredible power of one person's refusal to let media corruption be forgotten.